My wife told my 13-year-old daughter she didn't belong in this family. I know this because I heard her say it through the baby monitor I'd set up in my daughter's room 2 weeks earlier. The monitor was supposed to help us hear if our 6-month-old son had trouble sleeping, since we'd moved him into the nursery next to my daughter's room. Instead, at 11:30 on a Thursday night, I heard my wife Danielle's voice come through the speaker, saying those exact words to my daughter Mia. The audio was crystal clear. Danielle said Mia didn't belong in this family and never had. She said she'd tried to accept her, but it was getting harder to pretend. She said things would be easier for everyone if Mia just understood that she wasn't really part of what we were building here. I sat frozen on the couch with the monitor in my hand, listening to my daughter's voice crack as she asked what she was supposed to do about that. Danielle told her to figure it out. I'd been married to Danielle for 3 years, and we'd been together for 5 total. I'd met her at a charity fundraiser where my company was a sponsor, and she was working the event as a coordinator. Mia was 8 years old then, and had been living with me full-time for 2 years after her mother died in a car accident. The drunk driver who hit her got 6 years and served less than 4. Mia and I had learned to be a family of 2, and I wasn't actively looking for someone new when I met Danielle. She approached me at the silent auction and asked if I was enjoying the event. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and she gave me her card before moving on to other guests. I called her 3 days later and we met for coffee. Danielle knew from our first conversation that I was a widower with a young daughter. She asked thoughtful questions about Mia and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about her. She told me her own parents had divorced when she was young, and her stepmother had been wonderful, so she understood blended families could work if everyone tried. We dated for 6 months before she met Mia, and I appreciated that she didn't rush the introduction. When they finally did meet, Danielle brought Mia a book about a girl who loved science experiments. Mia had mentioned in passing that she liked chemistry, and somehow Danielle had remembered that detail from my stories. They got along well enough that Mia told me later she thought Danielle was nice, and seemed like she actually listened when people talked. The relationship progressed slowly and carefully, because I was determined not to disrupt Mia's life unnecessarily. Danielle and I were together for 2 years before we moved in together, and even then we didn't rush into marriage. We lived together for another year, while Mia adjusted to having Danielle around all the time. There were normal adjustment issues like schedules and space and learning each other's habits, but nothing that seemed like a red flag. Danielle would help Mia with homework and drive her to piano lessons when I had to work late. She remembered Mia's favorite foods and bought ingredients specifically for meals Mia enjoyed. She attended Mia's school concerts and cheered loudly when Mia performed. From everything I could see, Danielle was making a genuine effort to build a relationship with my daughter. We got married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden with about 50 guests. Mia was 11 and served as my best woman because she asked if she could stand with me instead of being a flower girl. Danielle had seemed touched by that and told Mia it was perfect. The wedding photos showed all 3 of us smiling and looking happy. I kept one on my desk at work that showed Danielle and Mia laughing at something during the reception. Looking at that photo now made me feel sick because I'd missed whatever was happening beneath the surface. 6 months after the wedding, Danielle got pregnant. We'd discussed having children together and both wanted to expand our family. Mia seemed excited about becoming a big sister and helped us set up the nursery. Our son Oliver was born in April after a relatively smooth pregnancy and delivery. Mia was 12 by then and incredibly helpful with the baby. She'd hold him while I made bottles or helped Danielle fold the endless loads of laundry that came with an infant in the house. She'd read to him even though he was too young to understand, practicing different voices for the characters in board books. Danielle had seemed grateful for the help and frequently told Mia she was a wonderful big sister. I thought we were settling into our new family dynamic well. Oliver was a good baby who slept in decent stretches and didn't cry excessively. Danielle had 6 months of maternity leave, and I'd taken 3 weeks of paternity leave to help with the transition. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The first real problem I noticed was about 3 months after Oliver was born. Danielle started making comments about Mia's behavior that seemed disproportionate to whatever Mia had actually done. Mia would leave a glass in the living room, and Danielle would spend 10 minutes talking about responsibility and respect for shared spaces. Mia would forget to put her shoes away, and Danielle would launch into a lecture about how she wasn't a maid. I'd point out that Mia was 12, and forgetting things was normal, but Danielle would say I was making excuses and not holding Mia accountable. The criticism felt constant and harsh in a way that hadn't existed before Oliver was born. I told myself it was stress from having a newborn and lack of sleep affecting Danielle's patience. Then Danielle started comparing Mia to other kids her age in ways that felt cruel. She'd mentioned that her friend's daughter was more mature or more helpful or more considerate. She'd point out when Mia struggled with something and say that other kids picked things up faster. She'd comment on Mia's appearance in ways that sounded like concern but felt like criticism. Mia's hair was too messy, or her clothes didn't match, or she needed to pay more attention to how she presented herself. Mia started spending more time in her room and less time in common areas of the house. I noticed, but I rationalized it as normal preteen behavior. I told myself Mia was just wanting more privacy and space as she got older. The baby monitor situation started because Oliver had begun sleeping through the night consistently, but Danielle insisted we needed to hear him if he woke up. His nursery was next to Mia's room at the end of the hall, and our master bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. I suggested just leaving our bedroom door open, but Danielle wanted the monitor for peace of mind. I set up a wireless system with a camera in Oliver's room and a speaker in our bedroom. The camera had night vision and motion detection, and the audio was surprisingly clear. I tested it a few times to make sure it worked and thought nothing more about it. I had no reason to suspect the monitor would pick up conversations happening in Mia's room next door. The night I overheard Danielle, I'd been watching television while Danielle put Oliver to bed. She usually spent about 30 minutes with him doing their bedtime routine before coming back downstairs. That night, 40 minutes had passed, and she still hadn't returned. I'd picked up the monitor to check if Oliver was still awake, and that's when I heard Danielle's voice. It wasn't coming from Oliver's room. The audio was bleeding through from Mia's room next door. I heard Danielle say that she needed Mia to understand something important. I turned up the volume and listened as my wife told my daughter that she didn't really belong in this family. My first reaction was complete disbelief. I must have misheard or misunderstood the context. I sat there listening as Danielle explained to Mia that she'd tried her best to accept her, but that blood was blood, and Mia wasn't hers. She said Oliver was her real son, and that changed things. She said she knew it sounded harsh, but Mia needed to hear the truth, instead of living in a fantasy where they were all one happy family. Mia's voice was small when she asked if her dad knew how Danielle felt. Danielle said I was too attached to Mia to see things clearly, that I felt guilty about her mother dying, and overcompensated by treating Mia like she was more important than she actually was. She told Mia that she couldn't say these things when I was around because I wouldn't understand. I felt like someone had poured ice water through my veins. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the monitor. I wanted to run upstairs immediately and confront Danielle, but something stopped me. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it, or claim I'd misunderstood. I needed proof of what I'd heard. I pulled out my phone and started recording the audio from the monitor. Danielle was still talking, telling Mia that she expected her to be more helpful around the house, since she wasn't contributing to the family in the same way Oliver was. She said Mia should start thinking about boarding schools for high school, because it might be better for everyone if there was some distance. Mia was crying now, trying to stay quiet, but her breathing was ragged. Danielle told her to pull herself together and not to mention this conversation to me. I recorded 8 minutes of audio before Danielle finally left Mia's room. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, and then she appeared at the top of the stairs looking completely normal. She came down and sat next to me on the couch, asking what I was watching. Her voice was pleasant and casual, like she hadn't just destroyed our 13-year-old daughter in the room upstairs. I managed to say something about a documentary, and she nodded and pulled out her phone to scroll through social media. I sat there next to her feeling like I was sitting next to a stranger. The woman I'd married wouldn't have said those things to a child. The woman who'd laughed with Mia at our wedding reception and helped her with science projects wouldn't have told her she didn't belong in her own family. But I had an 8-minute recording that proved Danielle was exactly that person. I waited until Danielle went to bed before I went upstairs to check on Mia. Her door was closed and her light was off, but I knocked gently anyway. She didn't answer, so I opened the door slowly and found her curled up under her blankets facing the wall. I asked if she was okay, and she said yes in a voice that made it clear she absolutely wasn't. I asked if we could talk, and she said she was tired and wanted to sleep. I told her I loved her, and she didn't respond. I stood in her doorway feeling completely helpless before finally leaving and closing the door behind me. I went to the guest room instead of my bedroom because I couldn't lie next to Danielle after what I'd heard. I spent the entire night staring at the ceiling trying to figure out what to do next. The next morning, I dropped Mia at school and called in sick to work. I needed time to think, and I couldn't focus on engineering problems when my family was falling apart. I went to a coffee shop across town where I wouldn't run into anyone I knew and listened to the recording I'd made the night before. Hearing it again in the stark light of morning made it worse somehow. Danielle's voice was calm and measured as she explained to my daughter that she was less important than her half-brother. There was no anger or emotion, just cold, factual statements about Mia's place in our family hierarchy. I saved the recording to 3 different locations, including a cloud backup. Then I started researching family law attorneys in our area. I found a firm that specialized in custody and divorce cases and called to make an appointment. The receptionist asked what kind of case I was dealing with, and I said I needed to discuss protecting my daughter in a potential divorce. She scheduled me for that afternoon with an attorney named Lawrence Brennan, who had 23 years of experience in family law. His office was in a modern building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the waterfront. Lawrence was in his 50s with graying hair and a firm handshake. I sat across from his mahogany desk and explained my situation as clearly as I could. I played him the recording I'd made from the baby monitor. Lawrence listened to the entire 8 minutes without interrupting. When it finished, he was quiet for a moment before asking how long this had been going on. I said I'd only discovered it last night, but looking back there had been signs for months that I'd dismissed. He asked about my custody arrangement with Mia, and I explained that I had full custody since her mother passed away. Danielle had no legal relationship to Mia and had never pursued adoption. Lawrence made notes and asked if there were other recordings or evidence of Danielle's treatment of Mia. I said I only had the one recording, but I could probably get more if I left the monitor running. He told me to document everything, but to be careful about recording laws in our state. He said what I'd captured might not be admissible in court depending on consent requirements. He explained that my priority needed to be protecting Mia emotionally and legally. He recommended I consider separation as soon as possible to remove Mia from the hostile environment. He warned me that Danielle might fight the divorce or try to claim rights to marital assets, including the house. I told him the house had been mine before the marriage and was titled in my name alone. He said that was good, but that Danielle could still claim it as a marital asset depending on how much equity had built up during our marriage. He suggested I document the home's value and my separate ownership thoroughly. We discussed custody of Oliver, and Lawrence said that would be the most complicated part. Danielle would have equal parental rights to Oliver, and I'd need to negotiate a custody arrangement that worked for both children. I left Lawrence's office with a folder full of information about divorce proceedings and a retainer agreement to review. He'd given me homework, document everything, secure my assets, and most importantly, talk to Mia about what had been happening. He said I needed to understand the full scope of Danielle's behavior before I could effectively protect my daughter. I drove home feeling sick about the conversation I was going to have with Mia. She'd been trying to handle this alone because Danielle had explicitly told her not to tell me. My daughter had been suffering in her own home, and I'd been too blind to see it. I picked Mia up from school and suggested we get ice cream instead of going straight home. She looked surprised but agreed. We went to a place near the waterfront with outdoor seating, and I bought her a sundae with extra hot fudge. We sat at a picnic table, and I asked her how long Danielle had been saying things like what I'd overheard last night. Mia's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and her face went pale. She asked how I knew about that, and I told her about the baby monitor accidentally picking up audio from her room. I said I'd heard everything Danielle said, and I needed to know if there was more. Mia started crying right there at the picnic table. She said it had been going on since Oliver was born, but it had gotten worse in the past few months. Danielle would wait until I was at work or out of the house, and then tell Mia things about how she wasn't really part of the family. She'd compare Mia to Oliver constantly, saying that he was her real child, and Mia was just someone she had to tolerate. She'd criticize everything Mia did and find fault with things that didn't matter. She'd told Mia that when she turned 18, she expected her to move out and stop being a burden. She'd said that if Mia told me any of this, she'd make sure I didn't believe her. She'd convinced Mia that I would choose my wife and new baby over my daughter from my first marriage. I felt rage building in my chest as Mia described months of emotional abuse I'd completely missed. I asked her why she hadn't told me, and she said she'd been afraid I wouldn't believe her, or that I'd be angry at her for causing problems in my marriage. She said Danielle was always nice when I was around, so it would be her word against Danielle's. She said she'd started to believe maybe Danielle was right, and she didn't really belong anymore. My 13-year-old daughter had been convinced by my wife that her own father might choose someone else over her. I pulled Mia into a hug right there in the ice cream shop and promised her that was never going to happen. I told her she was my priority, and always had been, and nothing would change that. We talked for over an hour sitting at that picnic table. Mia told me about specific incidents where Danielle had been cruel when I wasn't there to witness it. How Danielle would forget to save dinner for Mia when I worked late, or would schedule activities during times Mia had plans, or would criticize Mia's appearance and clothes in ways that seemed designed to destroy her confidence. She told me about the time Danielle had gone through her room and thrown away things she'd claimed were junk, including a stuffed animal that had belonged to Mia's mother. When Mia had gotten upset, Danielle had said she was being childish about a dirty toy. I felt physically ill listening to the systematic way Danielle had been hurting my daughter while presenting a completely different face to me. I told Mia that we were going to fix this and that she was safe. I explained that I'd already talked to a lawyer and we were going to make changes to protect her. She asked if that meant divorce, and I said yes. She looked relieved instead of upset, and that told me everything I needed to know about how bad things had gotten. A 13-year-old should be devastated about her parents' divorce, not relieved. The fact that Mia was glad we were separating meant Danielle had made our home so toxic that my daughter preferred her family breaking up to continuing to live with her stepmother. We drove home in silence, and Mia went straight to her room. I found Danielle in the kitchen making dinner and acting like everything was normal. I asked Danielle if we could talk, and she said sure while chopping vegetables. I told her I'd heard what she said to Mia the night before through the baby monitor. Her hand stopped mid-cut, and she was very still for a moment. Then she put down the knife and turned to face me with a confused expression. She asked what I was talking about, and I said I'd heard her tell Mia she didn't belong in this family. Danielle's face rearranged itself into concern, and she said I must have misheard or taken something out of context. She said she and Mia had been talking about feelings, and maybe Mia had expressed that she felt like she didn't fit in, and Danielle had been trying to reassure her. She said I was twisting a supportive conversation into something sinister. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Danielle's voice came through the speaker clearly and unmistakably telling Mia she didn't belong and that blood was blood. I watched Danielle's face as she listened to herself destroying my daughter. Her mask of concern cracked, and I saw real anger underneath. When the recording ended, she said I had no right to record private conversations. She said what she'd said to Mia was between them, and I was violating both their privacy by listening in. I told her she'd emotionally abused my daughter in her own home, and she was worried about privacy. She said I was being dramatic, and that I didn't understand the complexity of step-family dynamics. She said sometimes hard truths needed to be spoken, and I was too soft on Mia to say them myself. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I told Danielle she had 1 week to find somewhere else to live. She laughed and said I couldn't kick her out of her own home. I reminded her that the house was my separate property from before our marriage, and that she had no legal claim to it. She said we'd see about that, and that no judge would side with me over her. She said I was abandoning my marriage and my infant son because I was obsessed with my dead wife's daughter. The cruelty in her voice when she said that made me realize I'd never really known her at all. This person standing in my kitchen had been hiding beneath the surface for years, waiting until she felt secure enough to show her true nature. I told her to get out of my sight before I said something I'd regret. She grabbed her phone and her purse and left without another word. I called Lawrence Brennan and told him what had happened. He said I needed to change the locks immediately and start documenting everything. He said Danielle would likely try to return and claim I'd illegally evicted her. I needed to be prepared with proof that I'd given proper notice and that the house was my separate property. I called a locksmith who came out within 2 hours and installed new deadbolts on all the exterior doors. The total cost was $385, and I kept the receipt. I set up a small camera in the living room, pointed at the front door, in case Danielle tried to return while I wasn't home. Then I sat down with Mia and explained what was happening. Mia asked where Danielle had gone, and I said probably to her sister's house across town. She asked about Oliver, and I said we'd work out a custody arrangement where I could still see him regularly. She said she was sorry for causing problems, and I told her firmly that none of this was her fault. Danielle had chosen to be cruel, and I had chosen to protect Mia from that cruelty. Those were adult decisions and adult responsibilities, and Mia bore no blame for any of it. She nodded, but I could see she didn't fully believe me. Danielle had spent months convincing her that she was the problem and that damage wasn't going to heal overnight. Danielle called me 19 times that evening. I didn't answer any of the calls. She left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to threatening. She said she'd said things she didn't mean and wanted to work on our marriage. She said I was making a huge mistake and would regret choosing Mia over her. She said she'd fight me for custody of Oliver and make sure I never saw my son again. She said she'd tell everyone what kind of father I really was and destroy my reputation. I saved every single voicemail and backed them up along with the original recording from the baby monitor. Lawrence had been clear that documentation was crucial, and I was building a comprehensive file of Danielle's behavior. The next morning, Danielle showed up at the house at 7:15 while I was making breakfast for Mia. I saw her on the camera pulling into the driveway and knew she was going to try her key. She did, and when it didn't work, her face went dark with anger. She started pounding on the door hard enough that the frame rattled. I told Mia to go upstairs and stay in her room. Then I opened the door, but didn't step aside to let Danielle in. She demanded to know why I'd changed the locks on her house. I said it wasn't her house, and that she'd been given notice to vacate. She said she had rights as my wife and I couldn't just throw her out. I told her she could collect her personal belongings at a time we arranged through our lawyers, but she wasn't coming inside today. Danielle tried to push past me, and I blocked the doorway. She started yelling that I was keeping her from her son, and I said she could see Oliver with supervised visitation arranged through legal channels. She called me a psychopath and said she'd make sure everyone knew I was an unfit parent. I stayed calm and told her she needed to leave or I'd call the police. She said go ahead and call them because they'd see that I was the one being unreasonable. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Danielle stood there for another moment, clearly debating whether to call my bluff. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She sat in the driveway for 10 more minutes before finally driving away. I called Lawrence and told him what happened. He said to file for a restraining order immediately based on the harassment and the attempted forced entry. We scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week. In the meantime, he drew up formal divorce papers and had them prepared for filing. He explained that I'd be asking for full custody of Mia, which was straightforward since I already had it, and shared custody of Oliver with specific provisions about supervised exchanges. He said Danielle would likely fight everything and make the process as difficult as possible. I told him I didn't care how difficult it was as long as Mia was protected. I took Mia to see a child psychologist named Dr. Iris Chambers, who specialized in family trauma. Dr. Chambers had a practice in a converted Victorian house with a waiting room full of comfortable furniture and calming artwork. She met with Mia alone for the first session while I filled out intake paperwork in the waiting room. After 50 minutes, Dr. Chambers came out and asked to speak with me privately. We went to her office and she closed the door before sitting across from me with a serious expression. She said Mia had described a pattern of emotional abuse that was consistent and severe. She said Mia was showing signs of anxiety and depression that would require ongoing treatment. She recommended weekly therapy sessions and possibly medication if Mia's symptoms didn't improve. Dr. Chambers asked if I was documenting everything for potential legal proceedings. I told her about the recordings and the lawyer and the restraining order hearing. She said she'd be willing to write a letter documenting Mia's mental state and the impact of Danielle's treatment if it would help my case. I thanked her and said that would probably be necessary. She asked how I was holding up, and I realized no one had asked me that question yet. I said I was angry and scared and felt guilty for not seeing what was happening sooner. She said that was a normal response and suggested I consider therapy for myself as well. She gave me the name of a colleague who worked with adults dealing with family crises. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 in the morning. Lawrence prepared a packet of evidence including the audio recordings, the documentation of Danielle's attempts to access the house, and Dr. Chambers' letter about Mia's mental health. The night before the hearing, Danielle sent me a text message that said she was willing to drop everything and work on our marriage if I'd just stop this insanity. She said she loved me and Oliver and even Mia, despite our differences. She said families fought and made up, and this didn't have to end our marriage. I screenshot the message and sent it to Lawrence without responding. He replied saying it was more evidence of harassment and would help our case. The courtroom was smaller than I expected with fluorescent lighting and worn carpeting. Danielle was there with her lawyer, a woman named Christine Harper, who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate law firm. Judge David Wu reviewed our filings for several minutes before asking Danielle's side to present their argument. Christine claimed I was overreacting to a misunderstanding and that Danielle had been trying to help Mia adjust to having a new sibling. She said the recording had been taken out of context and that I'd violated Danielle's privacy by recording her without consent. She said Danielle had a right to access her marital home and see her infant son, and I was denying her both those things. Lawrence presented our evidence methodically. He played the full recording of Danielle telling Mia she didn't belong. He showed the timeline of Danielle's escalating behavior. He presented Dr. Chambers' letter documenting Mia's deteriorating mental health. He showed the voicemails and text messages where Danielle had threatened me and made demands. He explained that the house was my separate property, and Danielle had been given proper notice to vacate. He argued that Danielle's behavior toward Mia constituted emotional abuse, and that a restraining order was necessary to protect my daughter. Judge Wu asked Danielle directly if she had told Mia she didn't belong in the family. Danielle hesitated, and then said she'd been trying to have an honest conversation about family dynamics, and maybe her wording had been poor. The judge asked her to explain what honest conversation required telling a 13-year-old that blood was blood and she wasn't really part of what they were building. Danielle said I'd turned Mia against her and that Mia had been difficult and resentful from the beginning. She said she'd tried her best, but sometimes blended families just didn't work. Judge Wu looked at her for a long moment and then granted the restraining order. He said Danielle was to stay at least 500 feet from Mia at all times, and all contact with me had to go through our attorneys. He set a hearing for temporary custody of Oliver in 2 weeks. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Mia was legally protected now, but the fight over Oliver was just beginning. Danielle glared at me across the parking lot before getting in her car and driving away. Lawrence said the restraining order was a good start, but that Danielle would likely become more aggressive now that she'd been officially restricted. He said to maintain strict documentation of everything and to never communicate with her directly. I drove to Mia's school to tell her the good news. She was in her 4th period English class, and the office called her down. When I told her about the restraining order, she started crying. Not sad tears, but relief tears that she tried to hide by looking down at her shoes. The next 2 weeks were strange and tense. I had Oliver during the day while Danielle was at work, and she'd pick him up in the evening from Lawrence's office where we'd arranged supervised exchanges. She'd glare at me during the handoffs, but didn't speak. Oliver was 6 months old and had no idea his parents were in the middle of a divorce. I held him during those exchanges and felt my heart break a little, knowing I might not get to see him grow up the same way I'd been there for Mia. Danielle had equal parental rights, and the court wasn't going to give me full custody of Oliver no matter how much I wanted it. The temporary custody hearing for Oliver was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Both sides presented their proposed arrangements. I was asking for a 50-50 split with alternating weeks and shared decision-making on major issues. Danielle was asking for primary custody with me getting supervised visitation every other weekend. She claimed I was an unfit parent who'd chosen my older daughter over my infant son and couldn't be trusted to prioritize Oliver's needs. Lawrence tore apart that argument by pointing out that protecting one child from abuse didn't make me unfit to parent another child. He showed that I'd been Oliver's primary caregiver during the day while Danielle worked, and that disrupting that arrangement would harm Oliver. Judge Wu granted us joint legal custody with a 50-50 physical custody split. He said both parents were fit and capable, and Oliver deserved relationships with both of us. He ordered that exchanges happen at a neutral location and that both parties maintain civil communication regarding Oliver's welfare. Danielle's lawyer objected, but the judge's decision stood. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt like I'd won something important, even though the fight was far from over. The divorce still needed to be finalized, and Danielle was contesting the asset division, despite the prenuptial agreement Lawrence had made me get before the wedding. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 5 months. Danielle fought over everything from furniture to photograph albums. She claimed the house should be considered a marital asset because we'd lived in it together. Lawrence produced documentation showing I'd owned it outright before the marriage and had kept it titled in my name alone. She claimed she deserved spousal support because she'd given up career advancement to focus on our family. Lawrence showed that her career had actually progressed during our marriage, and she'd received a promotion and a raise while we were together. Every argument she made fell apart under scrutiny, but she kept trying. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for early December. Both sides submitted their final arguments and asset division proposals. Danielle got to keep her car and her personal belongings and received a small settlement for her contributions to household expenses during our marriage. Everything else stayed mine. The judge finalized the divorce, and we walked out as two separate people instead of a married couple. The whole marriage had lasted 3 years. I'd spent 5 years total in a relationship with someone who'd hidden her true nature until she felt secure enough to show it. The cost of my blindness had been my daughter's mental health and sense of security in her own home. Mia continued therapy with Dr. Chambers weekly and slowly started to improve. The anxiety that had made her withdrawn and quiet began to ease as she realized Danielle was really gone and wasn't coming back. She started bringing friends home again and laughing more often. She'd ask me questions about her mother sometimes, and I'd tell her stories about the woman who'd loved her more than anything. I'd show her photos and videos and letters her mother had written before she died. Mia deserved to know that she'd been wanted and loved from the beginning by someone who'd never made her feel like she was less than. Oliver transitioned to the custody schedule with minimal disruption because he was young enough not to understand what was happening. I'd see him every other week when he stayed with me, and it was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Wonderful because he was a happy baby who smiled easily and laughed at silly faces. Heartbreaking because I was missing half his life, and all his firsts would be split between 2 homes. Danielle and I maintained civil communication about Oliver's needs, but nothing more. She never acknowledged what she'd done to Mia, and I never expected her to. 6 months after the divorce finalized, Mia asked if we could redecorate her room. She wanted to paint over the color Danielle had chosen and pick out new furniture that felt like hers. We spent a weekend at home improvement stores looking at paint samples and furniture options. She chose a soft purple for the walls and white furniture with clean lines. We painted together on a Saturday, getting more paint on ourselves than on the walls. She put on music, and we sang along badly while we worked. It felt like we were painting over more than just wall color. We were covering up the years Danielle had been there and creating something new that was just ours. The house felt different after Danielle left. Lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted that I hadn't fully recognized while it was pressing down on us. Mia started smiling more and talking more and taking up space in ways she hadn't felt safe doing before. She'd sprawl on the couch doing homework with her materials spread across the coffee table. She'd play music loud enough that I could hear it from the kitchen. She'd invite friends over without asking permission first because she knew they were welcome. Little by little, she was reclaiming her space and her confidence. I started dating again about a year after the divorce, but I was careful in ways I hadn't been before. I paid attention to how people treated Mia from the very beginning. I watched for signs that they saw her as an obstacle or a burden. I trusted Mia's instincts about people and listened when she said she didn't like someone. The relationship I'd had with Danielle had taught me that people could hide their true natures for years, and that protecting my daughter had to be my first priority always, not second or equal, first. Mia thrived as she got older. She joined the robotics club at school and discovered she loved programming. She made the honor roll consistently and talked about studying computer science in college. She'd show me projects she was working on and explain them with patience when I didn't understand the technical aspects. Watching her confidence grow and seeing her become herself again was the best outcome I could have hoped for after everything that happened. She'd survived emotional abuse from someone who should have protected her, and she'd come out stronger on the other side. The summer Mia turned 15, we took a trip together to the coast. Just the 2 of us spending a week in a rental house on the beach. We walked along the water every morning and cooked dinner together every evening. One night after dinner, we sat on the porch watching the sun set, and she thanked me for choosing her. She said she knew it had been hard to end my marriage and split custody of Oliver, but that she appreciated that I'd protected her when it mattered. I told her she never had to thank me for that. Choosing her wasn't hard. It was the easiest and most important decision I'd ever made. Danielle remarried 2 years after our divorce to someone without children. I heard about it through mutual friends and felt nothing. No anger or sadness or regret. Just a distant curiosity about whether her new husband knew what kind of person she really was. Maybe she'd learned from our marriage and would be different with him. More likely, she'd just found someone whose situation didn't trigger her resentment. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. I'd moved on and built a life that centered Mia's well-being and Oliver's happiness as much as shared custody allowed. Oliver grew into a sweet kid who loved both his parents and didn't understand why they lived in different houses. I explained it to him in age-appropriate ways as he got older. Mia was wonderful with him, patient and kind in ways that showed she'd never blamed him for what Danielle had done. She understood that Oliver was her brother and that the choices adults made weren't his fault. She'd read to him when he stayed with us, and help him with art projects, and teach him to build things with blocks. Watching them together made me believe we'd all survived the worst of it, and come out okay on the other side. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.